The other issue is alternative analyses. That's something in the past that no one's really wanted to go to. You really don't want to provide us with another option. In other words, instead of 124 turbines, provide other alternatives of, say, 30, 10, or 5 turbines. And enough agencies also indicated that that was important, that you ought to be doing that. And also, I might add for our friends in line, is also, with respect to transmission line, I think you really ought to have an alternative there as an underground transmission line as an option. If for no other reason than to give these folks a sense of what that would cost, and if you end up going with a surface, the typical transmission line, what the savings are, and I think that'd just be valuable to them to know in terms of mitigating costs. What's the difference in how much did they save if they go that way? Multiple years environmental study recommended. You go through that and you'll find out the involved agencies are all saying we had to do more with the bird and bat studies, and it's broken down into a number of segments. There are some studies in which they had a little bit more time, but generally with migrational stuff and what have you, a lot of it really wasn't all that intensive. It didn't have the 3 years that was required by and recommended by Fish and Wildlife Service and a number of other environmental agencies. Migrational studies. Migrational studies are important to us because this is, our town is part of a migratory corridor for birds and bats and what have you. We've got part of our town in which they come right up the eastern shore of Lake Ontario, and they move along the river. So this is very important. The studies that were done there by West back in 2006 and 2007, there was only 1 year. There were real questions, as you will see in here when you go back to it, about where they placed the radar for doing all that stuff. And really, you really weren't in a position to make any judgments about a scale or a scope of spatial dynamics with respect to the migration stuff. So more work really has to be done in that regard. Where are we? Wind turbine? Are we down a wind turbine operational plan? That's something new and that's something different. That's something you haven't addressed. But in the Fish and Wildlife Service, for them to be involved, particularly you're going to be looking for them for taking permits or anything like that, or any of their involvement. They've said, in effect, that because of concern over bats, they made a recommendation back in 6/15/07 to mitigate potential impacts to bats. The turbine should not have a cutting speed of less than 6 meters per second, and an operation should be curtailed between July 15th and September 15th. So it's a 5-hour period. You really got to address that, we feel, and have that as part of your analysis. In other words, you're talking about adjusting the operation of your proposal based on concerns and recommendations from Fish and Wildlife Service. And that's been, as I said, that's been out since '07. It's part of their guidelines and whatnot, particularly if you got bats. And you know that you've already identified that back in 2007 in this town, there are Indiana bats. It just wasn't a hypernaculum back in Dexter somewhere. We actually had them right just over the hill here, and we did quite a bit. They even had enough of them that they did radio telemetry stuff and were able to understand some of the movements of the Indiana bat itself. Risk assessment. That was U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service made that point in a number of things. And risk assessment, again, you're getting into analytical work, you're getting into what numbers of birds and bats that you're building, that type of thing. And a thing that we would point out is when we went through and you looked at your studies that have been done in the past there, Mr. Chandler, they really were looking at everything else. They were looking at mortality rates for Maple Ridge and some other areas, but we've got one right across the river. And so what we're saying here is to incorporate the kind of work that was done over there on the river into any kind of analysis. And again, we've got to get into analysis looking at numbers and going back to the cumulative impacts. It has to be more than just, more than just the neighboring wind farm. If I recall, Fish and Wildlife Service said you have to consider as many as 700 turbines. You have to consider the impacts of Maple Ridge and some of these other areas. And long-term environmental management plan, that has to be, that's more or less like your adaptive management plan. And that's important. In general, we put down inadequate environmental studies, and I think in general, when you go through, when we went through, those of us that reviewed some of those those comments from the involved agencies, we came back to that time and time again, is the fact that they weren't adequate and more work should have been done. And the unfortunate thing is at the time, our planning board and that, as lead agent, really wasn't very receptive to those kinds of comments. They could have done a better job. Another big one is mapping, and I would say, from what I see over here in this board, this has been here since October, and a lot of agencies have said, I mean, you really got to do a good job with the mapping. I know our own planning board, when they sit down, if they had the maps that had the overlays of all the sensitive areas, the archaeological stuff and that type of thing, along with your project layout, as well as property lines and all that detail is really important. And that's basically what they were saying right here, particularly with wetlands, that you know, in the past, everything they've seen really hasn't been adequate or appropriate. And I think that we have, in general, feel that way. Really got to do a better job than we've seen in the past. Here's the other issue is project benefit. That goes back to the earlier discussion we had about cost and benefit. Mitigating visual impacts is another issue. And really what was, I think Public Service Commission was saying in effect too on this issue, look at other options and traditional methods in which you deal with visual concerns and impacts that you want to mitigate. And not just to blow it off and say, hey, these things are big, they're going to be spinning, they're going to attract your attention, and then sorry, but there's not much you can do about it. They're indicating, hey, take a look at particularly the historical and cultural assets, see if you can move turbines around, see if you can scale them back, look at setbacks. The other thing to do is don't necessarily not consider using buffers and screenings and what have you. So again, we're using recommendations made by the involved agencies. Historical and cultural assets. Again, I think the important one is back in the PSC was saying that, in effect that this does have, what the project you're proposing here has a very dramatic and substantive impact on the area. And of course, our area, people come here because of its beauty and its character and what have you. That's important. And the involved agencies have said, in fact, that you really ought to be doing more to consider those impacts and try to minimize them. Basic species plan, you've already indicated that you've got that in your list. And we would only point out that we also have concerns here for some swallow wardens and other plants and bases that we hope that you would consider and find ways to mitigate or minimize their impact. Natural heritage vegetated landscapes. This goes back to the mapping again. I mean, the only way you can really do a lot of this stuff is to consider these things. And this data is available through the state and what have you. And we found that in our comprehensive plan, you'll find some of that. But to be able to include that stuff and use it when you're considering your project layout would be very important. And the final, getting near the end here, the coastal zone contingency review, that came out as a recommendation of the Public Service Commission about coastal zone management areas, because we have a number of areas here that have been identified through that program, and they sort of indicate that there's a specialized review process that has to go through that I do not think that you have complied with, but if you have, then it's not a problem. And finally, decommissioning, the last issue. And I think that's considered in many of these projects in the past and what have you, but we're entering into an Article 10 situation here, and if this thing is pushed down our throats for some of us, and I have a project here that's really not not compatible with our comprehensive plan, that type of thing. We're living with it, and we're not going to have very much control. I don't know who you're going to be complaining to and what the town's role is going to be in all this. But for decommissioning in particular, I don't know what role that has if Article 10 has been taken over by the state and that type of thing. But that's a concern that we don't want to be left holding the bag. So this is going to be a concern of ours. For the decommissioning and hopefully having something. I know this is going to be an LLC. In other words, if it's left here and then people take off, if you're not going to have anything other than the assets that sit here. And so there's not going to be very much leverage from our standpoint. But we have to have some method to account for that. And that's basically it. That's the list. And I would point out, there's a lot of effort went into that, for people who are going through it and what have you. I hope that, we're putting that out early and hope that people incorporate this stuff into your PSS.
Appreciate the feedback.